Hey everybody, you're listening to the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Billy Z. And normally at this point you would be hearing, I'm Brian Pittard, I'm Steve Morey. Unfortunately, I don't have my co-host with me tonight in the Comic Book Bears den, but what I do have for you is an interview I recently conducted with Justin Hall. Justin is a queer cartoonist and educator out of San Francisco. A few years ago, he edited the No Straight Lines anthology, which was published by Fantagraphics. And what Justin is in the midst of right now is a Kickstarter campaign for a documentary film based on that book. So what you're going to hear right now is one of our patented explosions, and then I'll be back with my interview with Justin. We are thrilled to bring to the show for the first time Justin Hall. Justin is a queer cartoonist, and he's also a professor of comic books. How would you say that, Justin? How do you academically bucket that? The MFA program you teach?
My actual title?
Yeah.
Is I'm an associate professor of comics at the California College of the Arts.
Awesome. Justin is here to talk about the Kickstarter that he is shepherding for No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics. Now, if that name is familiar to you, it's because you probably have it in your shelves there, published by Fantagraphics 2012. Again, that was an anthology that dealt specifically with the history, at that point, over 40 years of queer cartoons and comics. And what Justin is involved with producer-director Vivian Kleiman, is bringing a version of No Straight Lines to the documentary screen. So, Justin, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
It's a total pleasure. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, we have a standard question for everybody who comes on the show. We're like Loverboy, we start from the start. How did you get into comics?
I've been obsessed ever since I can remember. It's how I learned how to read. So my mother, read me I remember there was a collection of the Golden Age Wonder Woman comics with a foreword by Gloria Steinem. Mm-hmm. And my mother read those to me when I was a little kid. That's some of my earliest memories. So of course that made me a, weirdo, gay pervert because it's the Golden Age Wonder Woman. It's awesome. That's how I learned how to read. And I never got over it. I grew up reading, Tintin and Asterix, as well as all the superhero comics. I was obsessed with Jack Kirby, and all of his work. So I've been a lifelong comics fan.
And you started doing your own comics when, around 2001 or so?
Well, I always wanted to make comics, but when I was young, there were no comics programs. So I went into a college art program and at a State University of New York at Purchase, and tried to kind of create my own comics thing, and with limited success. So I came out of that, and then ended up spending quite a bit of time just kind of bumming around the world. I was backpacking quite a bit at that time. And about 10 years after that, right when I hit 29, actually, I was in Israel, and I saw the Dead Sea Scrolls in their museum outside of Jerusalem. And I became kind of obsessed with that history, that story, and immediately wrote this, the script for a comic in this cafe in West Jerusalem, and then turned that into a comic called A Sacred Text. And back in the day, there was this thing called the Zarek Grant, mm-hmm. which was an award that was funded by one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle guys. And it's defunct now, it's not around anymore. But if you look at their roster of folks who have gotten the award over the years, it's really this interesting kind of who's who of different self-publishing and indie comics creators. So I did my first comic with them, with that grant, and then kind of got into it from there. So.
Now, before we started recording, I had mentioned about the history to you mm-hmm. of No Straight Lines, where this initially started as an art exhibition, then became a book that you edited, and now is taking this form. So why don't you take us through that history yourself and how it's developed and what you specifically want to do with this project? Because I love the book, and there's a couple of things I'd love to talk to you about, but I really want to hear it from you first.
Thanks. Yeah. So I live in San Francisco, and we have this wonderful museum here, the San Francisco Cartoon Art Museum. And in the beginning of the 2000s, when I first started making comics and getting involved in the comic scene here in the Bay Area, going to conventions and such, I met these folks that run the museum. And I pitched this project to them. I pitched a museum show of LGBTQ comics, and they leapt at it, even though I was pretty unknown at the time. And it was a wonderful experience. I got to put together this essentially the world's first museum show of queer comics. And that was how I met Alison Bechdel and Howard Cruz and people like that, was because I had to reach out to them to get their work for this show. And we called it No Straight Lines, and wanted to do at the time we wanted to do a book of the show, but we couldn't raise the funds to get it done. But that kind of kicked around in my head for a while after that, and eventually I decided to make a real book out of it and really go much farther than I had been able to in the actual show, but really seriously dive into the history of queer cartooning. At that point, I was working with Prism Comics, which is a nonprofit advocacy group for LGBTQ comics. And I've been their talent relations, the head of talent relations. So I've been doing sitting a lot of panels at, comic conventions and running the queer press grant and stuff like that. So I just had kind of increased my contacts within the queer comics world, and knew I could kind of reach out directly to a lot of these cartoonists and ask for permission to use their work in this book. So I spent, the whole project kind of working off and on it. It took about 3 years to kind of put the whole thing together. I also dug into different archives. I went to the Last Gasp, is a underground comics publisher from the 60s that still exists here in San Francisco as an independent distributor. And I was able to go into their archives and kind of dig through their, labyrinthian shelving and find these old copies of, interesting queer and feminist underground comics from the 70s, and then dug through a lot of the queer newspapers and found strips from there. Went to the zines, the kind of punk zines as well, and then kind of finishes with the beginning of the webcomics scene, which of course has blown up since the book came out. But it was about 3 years, and I went to Fantagraphics, and they jumped at it, which was really great. They're incredible to work with, a wonderful publisher, and really care about the material. And I knew that they would keep it in print, which was really what I wanted to make sure about. Mm-hmm. So keep it available as an archive for future generations of academics and cartoonists and fans. I feel really passionately about that. This particular kind of history, queer history in general, tends to get lost because it's not passed down through families. And cartoonist history, comics history, is oftentimes also lost because it hasn't been really treated well by the academic world. I teach a class in comics history and cultural context right now at CCA in our MFA in comics program. And there's no textbook for comics history, which is amazing. Like if I was teaching the history of photography or the history of Renaissance painting or the history of, classical music, there'd be many different textbooks to choose from. But with comics, it's so new to the world of academia. It's so new that people are taking it seriously as an art form that there's just not a lot of material done on this. So I knew that, at the same time, I knew that the queer, there's this kind of insular queer media world of the queer publishers, distributors, newspapers, retailers, the gay lesbian bookstores, all this stuff that kind of supported a couple of decades of LGBTQ comics work. A lot of that was collapsing. Mm-hmm. So this was like 2012, right? So it was already starting to really collapse. We were watching a lot of the gay lesbian bookstores and newspapers and such fall apart. Yeah. And there was also the difference where the queer bookstores were the only places, queer and feminist bookstores were the only places that would actually sell this kind of material. But eventually, with the increasing acceptance of queer people and queer themes and lives in the mainstream culture, those books migrated over to kind of regular mainstream bookstores. So there was less of a need for this queer media insular world. But what I was worried about was with the collapse of that world, that, some of these creators would be able to kind of launch into the mainstream, right? Like an Alison Bechdel. But some, Diane DeMasa's hothead paisan homicidal lesbian terrorist is never going to make it into the mainstream, right? So I wanted to make sure to, create this book to kind of spotlight this work before it vanished completely.
One thing that I have to say that I really admired about the book, and you mentioned this, that there's no particular textbook, I felt the book was scholarly without being suffocatingly scholarly. And I don't know if that was an intention of yours, but it was about as breezy a history read as you could get. I thought.
Thank you. That's a wonderful. I really appreciate that. I was trying. I care deeply about the history, but I don't. One of my frustrations with, there is a kind of an ivory tower feel that can happen oftentimes with academia, and I feel that kind of thing is a betrayal to comics, which is very much a populist and DIY sort of art form. It's art for the people and by the people. So I wanted to make that history as accessible as possible. So that really makes me. It's a wonderful thing to hear that came across.
And I think that you really displayed within the book that there is this, and has been for some time, an intersection between queer culture and comic culture. Sometimes they affect each other subversively, but it's always been there.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And there's something about kind of, I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, this idea of storytelling that's both visual and verbal. That there's text and image in comics, and so you can kind of tell narratives that are very complete. And there's a hunger. I think there has always been a real hunger for people who have been so severely underrepresented to see themselves, right? To literally see themselves. So Alison Bechdel, in the introduction to her Dykes to Watch Out For collection, talked about that she wanted to make lesbians visible. Mm-hmm. Right. So these are people who queers have been invisible by the dominant culture for so long. And there's something incredibly powerful about telling queer stories from an insider's perspective, but also literally seeing them on the page. And then, beyond that, I think the DIY nature of comics, which has been so kind of hardwired and really kind of baked into the medium from the very beginning, because you don't really need, unlike film or other forms, you don't need a lot of resources, right? Mm-hmm. You don't need a lot of technology. All you need ultimately is a piece of paper and a pen and a photocopy machine and a stapler, if to make a little mini comic or a self-published zine or whatever. So that, of course, also appeals to queer communities that oftentimes are, under economic hardships and just have a hard time getting their work into mainstream publications.
Another thing, and you just hit it with the zines, I was fascinated by the Riot Girl component.
Yeah.
This is coming from somebody who, had seen Bikini Kill back in the day and everything, and I was completely unaware of that element because it wasn't necessarily aimed at me.
Yeah, that was actually kind of digging into that myself. It was surprising to me how much good material there was back then. I think a lot of it was actually that era of the kind of 90s Riot Girl punk movement was very the best stuff was being done by women. So it was really around kind of queer women were just doing this tremendous creative and cultural production during that time period. Later on, people like Rob Kirby and David Kelly created Boy Trouble to kind of catch up, basically, so the boys could kind of catch up to what the women were doing. But really, that era was very much about the women. People like Jennifer Camper and Leanne Franson, and there was this huge range of really important queer women making work.
Another thing that you put forth in the book, which really surprised me, is in some ways the erotic queer comics are far better archived and collected than the more slice of life. I mean, it seems like it was the more slice of life things that were in danger of disappearing, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's a very strange reversal from what you'd expect, right? Where usually erotica is kind of swept under the rug, right? But in terms of queer comics production, it's actually been better archived because of groups like the Tom of Finland Foundation and the Center of Sex and Culture, places that have been really good about archiving and keeping in print, or if not in print, at least kind of archiving materials that were made by queer people for erotic purposes. And that's really the origins of queer comics really come out of the erotic work, right? I say that Tom of Finland is really the first gay cartoonist. Mm-hmm. And of course you can, what does queerness mean? What does gayness mean? What does comics mean? I mean, you can kind of parse those terms out in different ways. certainly there are frescoes and queer erotic vases back from from the Greek times, but in the ways that we kind of think of them in terms of modern definitions, I think that Tom of Finland really is the first, and he started making his Kake comics back in the mid 1960s, and those really were the first sequential queer narratives that were done, not as derogatory things by other people, but rather as kind of a celebratory thing done by an out queer person. And it was erotic. And it was also completely illegal at that time, which is, I think we sometimes forget that how incredibly dangerous making that material was for so long.
Yeah.
But it really, so that stuff is, thankfully has been well archived. Whereas the more slice of life, memoir stuff, and even more some other genre work, what I would call kind of literary queer comics, right? Queer comics that are not erotic. That stuff was more in danger of being lost.
Yeah, and I didn't think of this until now, with Tom of Finland, with these impossible physical stereotypes. There kind of is alignment with superheroes. In a sense.
Oh yeah. Tom of Finland, it's fascinating. I actually just did this teaching stint in Denmark and also in Sweden. And whenever I do a lecture on the history of queer comics or the history of erotic comics, I always include Tom of Finland. He's a very, very important figure. And usually for an American audience, if they're not queer themselves, they won't know who he is. In Scandinavia, everybody knows who he is, which is funny. I mean, he's on a stamp from Finland. You can buy bed sheets in any kind of Finnish department store with his characters on them. Not the penises necessarily, but I think there, he has this. He's had this, profound kind of underground aesthetic influence that people are mostly unaware of. I mean, he's really influenced everybody from Mapplethorpe to, kind of fine art all the way through to superhero and kind of, advertising and all different kinds of mainstream work as well. And people just don't understand that history.
Well, I also have to thank you for that particular book, introducing me to the work of certain people. Sometimes people are names in some article that you don't get a flavor of what they are like, and the work of Robert Triptow just blew me away.
Oh, is it good?
And I do not think I ever would have had the proper exposure to that if not for your book.
Yeah, he's mind blowing. I mean, he was the editor of the Gay Comics anthology series. He was the second editor after Howard Cruse and before Andy Mangels. So he also did a stint there where he was kind of running that show. But he's also just this incredible cartoonist who really has this this biting sense of humor, this kind of really interesting perspective on slice of life and memoir.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. Okay, well, we're not necessarily here to talk about the book. We got to talk about the documentary. So why don't you tell us what's going on with this particular Kickstarter? Yeah,
so the whole thing started right after I produced the book, and I was in the gym, and this friend of mine, a kind of acquaintance really, came up, and he said he was a film guy, and he said, you should make a documentary film out of this. And I'm like, okay. I tend to kind of smile and nod, basically, and kind of say yes to everything, which can get me into trouble at times as well. But we kind of started, fooling around with it, trying to figure it out. And he really was not the person to shepherd the whole project. But then I hooked up with this guy a friend of mine named Greg Sirota, and he's a real film professional, and we worked on this material for a little while and banged out the first trailer for the film, which I'm very proud of. Like, we did some filming with Ed Luce, Mary Wings, a little bit with Allison and with Howard, Allison Bechdel, Howard Cruse. So, and then we put that together into a trailer. And then unfortunately he moved down to Los Angeles and pulled back from the project. But he introduced me to Vivian Kleiman. And Vivian is another real film professional. She's a Peabody Award winner, and she had a piece she executive produced, was nominated for an Eisner. I mean, she's really kind of part of this documentary filmmaking world. So we've been now working together for probably about 2 years. And we went to Vermont and filmed with Allison, a couple day shoots. with Howard in Massachusetts for a couple of days as well. We did a bunch of filming at the Queers and Comics Festival here in San Francisco. So we've been doing a lot of work together, and it's been really amazing to watch filmmakers at work and really see them working their craft. We have this amazing cinematographer too, who's just got such an eye for visual detail and also visual storytelling. And there's a lot of crossover, obviously, into how we think of things as cartoonists, but also a lot of differences, obviously. So the film is going to be very different from the book. It can't possibly be the kind of historical overview, and the book was able to include a lot of creators. I think there's over 100 creators in the book, and that's impossible. We can basically do about 5 creators. You can't really do more than that in terms of their personal stories and character arcs. Because it just becomes too unwieldy for a 90-minute film. So we've had to choose, who those final characters are going to be, and then introduce other people, other cartoonists as kind of a Greek chorus that can kind of put things into cultural and historical perspective and artistic perspective, and then find archival footage and film B-roll, which at conventions and at other events to put everything in perspective. So it's a lot of, and then of course the art itself has to be featured. So there's a lot of moving parts to doing a film like this, and it's going to be a very different kind of animal ultimately than the book. But I think it'll function really nicely as a companion piece, because what the book doesn't do is it doesn't really give you a sense of who these creators are, right? It displays the work and it tells you the cultural and historical context for that work, but you don't get to see Howard, chatting with his husband and doing his drawings, and you don't get to see Allison kind of, fighting with her cat as she explains, the origins of Dykes to Watch Out For, and, the kind of painful family origins of Fun Home. People like Mary Wings, who created the first lesbian comic book, Come Out Comics in 1973. She's this amazing character who's just incredibly dynamic on film. She plays the accordion, and she's got these 2 little terriers that will sing along with her. So we have this amazing footage of, she's talking about her comics, and then she, smokes a joint from the pot that she's growing in her backyard, and she pulls out her accordion and starts playing, and the dogs start singing along, and it's it's amazing. I mean, these obviously, as you might imagine, a lot of these cartoonists are actually really interesting people themselves, and all that comes across in the film. There's something about film as a medium that has a real gravitas to it, and especially when you're creating a portrait of someone, a portrait of an artist. So I'm very excited about getting that material out there to everybody.
Okay, and as I saw in the trailer, there's going to be a focus on a small amount of creators as the main,
Yes.
and who are they?
So we're not exactly, I don't want to give exactly everybody at this point, because we're still kind of working out some stuff, but certainly Alison Bechdel, creator of Fun Home and Dykes to Watch Out For, she's the most she's had the largest kind of mainstream crossover success with Fun Home. Howard Cruz, who's considered the kind of godfather of queer comics. He was the first editor of the Gay Comics anthology series, and he created Stuck Rubber Baby, which is the first kind of great queer graphic novel. It came out in 1995, so about 11 years before Fun Home did, and it really was ahead of its time.
And amazing that it stayed in print at a major publisher through all that time. Really amazing. In some ways, I think it's arguably the great American graphic novel. I mean, it's a profoundly ambitious work. It's set in Alabama during the Civil Rights era, and it's a young white man who's struggling with coming out as a gay man. But it's in the midst of the Civil Rights struggle, right? So there's all this African American characters and their struggles for equality as well, and so there's the intersections of kind of gender and race and regional concerns of the South, and of course sexuality. It's a monumental work. So it's really wonderful to kind of give him the homage that he deserves.
we'll also be going back and doing more work with Mary Wings, who's the created the first lesbian comic book. But there's also Rupert Kennard. I'm very excited about filming with. We haven't filmed with him really at all yet, and he's up in Portland. He created the first Black queer characters in comics, Brown Bomber and Diva Touche Flambe, it was a immortal lesbian, superpowered lesbian, and these characters were the first, African-American queer characters, and Rupert is this amazing artist. He's wheelchair bound now after a car accident, so his work is kind of informed by all of these intersections, and he's a lovely man. So I'm very, very excited about getting to film with him as well.
Cool. Okay, well, I just wanted to ask you in relation to where we are right now, because we've been talking about queer comics from a historical perspective for the majority of this interview. Where do you feel that we are right now? Because I had discussed earlier intersectionality, and I think we're in an interesting time where you can have somebody like Sina Grace who can put out a fanzine about the weirdest dicks he sucked, and at the same time write a very mainstream comic in Iceman. Yeah. So how do you feel that the climate is right now? Because, at least for me, for the first time, I'm seeing trans creators without trying to scout for them. There seems to be a bigger spotlight on diverse creators. And I'm just wondering how you feel things are right now, the terrain is right now.
I think it's a tremendously exciting moment. We're seeing this incredible expansion of queer creative talent and vocal queer fandom, as well as really changing the landscape. It's interesting you're talking about someone like Sina, and his career exemplifies how this has worked, where there's still what I would call kind of underground and real queer comics, right? Which would be comics telling the stories of queer lives and experiences from an insider's perspective, as opposed to the mainstream, right? And now queer characters are coming into the mainstream, which is wonderful. That's fairly new, right? It wasn't that long ago that Jim Shooter, who is the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, said there are no gays in the Marvel universe, right, in the 80s. And since then, we've had a kind of steady increase of queer characters appearing in the mainstream. But it's still the job of the mainstream to bring in and assimilate and normalize LGBTQ characters into the mainstream, right? It's not their job it remains the job of the queer underground comics, or queer comics in particular, to analyze, poke fun at, celebrate, get into the kind of nitty-gritty of queer experiences and lives, and from an insider's perspective. And that's a very different kind of thing, different kind of project. So, for example, you look at some of the stories from the Gay Comics anthology series. You have someone like Burton Clark, who in Gay Comics number 2, I believe it was, created a story called this Cy Ross and the Snow Queen Syndrome, which is about a black man who's attracted to white guys, and he's being called out on that by one of his black friends about internalized racism. And it's a very funny comic, but it really analyzes the idea of internalized racism within the gay community, right? That's not really appropriate for an Archie comic, right? So it's great that Archie has a gay character, but it's not really appropriate with an Archie to dig into the kind of really interesting kind of more intense subject matter. And Sina is a great example of this. His personal work, his memoir work in particular, he really dives deep. Whether he's talking about the weird dicks he sucked, or his really intense memoir, dives into personal identity and into his, battles with anxiety and all this kind of stuff. So, but at the same time, he can go and write an openly gay superhero for Marvel Comics. So both of those things can happen at once now, which is really a wonderful thing. It's really, really exciting. So that's happening. At the same time, I think the web has also transformed everything, obviously. So we're watching this explosion of queer content in webcomics. There was a time I was talking to Jennifer Camper or Allison about this, where there was a time when all the queer cartoonists really knew each other. And that's not possible anymore. There's just too many. There's too many. Like every time I go online, I feel like I'm discovering another queer cartoonist making this incredible webcomic about whatever, right? And we don't know each other, and it's more international, obviously, as well. So the world, it's just kind of exploded outward. So that kind of expansion of creative content is really remarkable, and that's what we're living in right now.
I also think you have a climate right now where you have some straight but gay-friendly creators. Names that immediately come to mind, the first one that comes to mind is Dean Haspiel, where there's very much a queer sensibility. You can feel those influences have coalesced around something there.
So I actually I've known Dean since college.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we were friends in college, and I actually ended up dating his roommate, who ended up being kind of crazy. So there's actually, I did that as a comic story in the anthology Queer with the two E's or 333 from Northwest Press. It's a story called Seductive Summer.
I have no idea.
That's about Dean Haspiel's old roommate. So Dean and I have known each other for over 20 years. And absolutely, he was in an extremely queer-friendly place in college, and he's always maintained that sensibility.
It's interesting because we've always had that element there. I've always considered the Hernandez brothers queer creators, in a sense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Whether it's because they were the first on the block with that particular vibe. I just think it's very interesting that you're seeing more and more of that, where you do have allied creators who aren't afraid. And I think that's a good way of putting it, who aren't afraid to go there.
Yeah. There's also, Gilbert Hernandez, not only did, Jaime and Gilbert put into their comics, incredibly important and groundbreaking openly queer characters from the very beginning, they also included in their erotica. Mm-hmm. So Birdland, which was Gilbert's erotic series, is one of the most, it actually had this profound effect on me when I think I read it when I was, I guess in high school or college, and see, kind of early days of my sexuality, right? And seeing this comic that was created by a straight guy, but it's completely pansexual. Mm. There are men going at it, and women going at it, men and women, and aliens, and and it's celebratory, and all of the boundaries are crossed. And it is, I remember reading that and just feeling like the world was limitless, that there were no boundaries to the possibilities of sexuality. And it was amazing. And it comes from a straight creator who's just, an incredible ally and incredibly just evolved on these kind of issues. One thing I would say, just to kind of add to that, I think and this is something I talked with my students about, we're at this interesting moment in terms of, identity and what creators are kind of allowed to talk about and what they should talk about, right? Because on the one hand, there's kind of two different cultural lessons that are being taught, I think, at the moment. On the one hand, it's extremely important that creators who have been marginalized are allowed to express themselves and create their own characters, their own themes, their own creative production. So you see this with trans creators, for example. Trans creators creating trans characters, very, very important. Because oftentimes the first representation of a given group is not done by the group itself. So even, for example, with lesbians, Trina Robbins, who was a straight woman, created Sandy Comes Out in 1972 in the pages of Women's Comics #1, and that was the first comic story about a lesbian that was not erotic or derogatory, the first literary story about a lesbian, a coming out story. Then it was Mary Wings the next year creating Come Out Comics, who told it from an insider's perspective, right? Told it as an openly lesbian person. And then you see the same thing with trans characters and trans creators, right? You have people like Neil Gaiman introducing trans characters and their Nannies brothers as well early on. But, Diana Green comes in 1995 and creates Tranny Towers. You have Tranny Tunes by Dylan Edwards in 2001, Gina Kamensky's T-Gina rather. And that's an important moment, right, where trans creators get to create their own stories about themselves or about people, about characters like themselves. So we need to support that. We need to support a diversity of creators creating stories from an insider's perspective, from their perspective. At the same time, we also have an onus to expand for all creators to expand their storytelling, right? So I am a cisgender white man, living in America, right? But not all of the people that I interact with are other cisgender white men, right? So it remains my responsibility as a creator to broaden the scope of my storytelling, to make sure that I have characters who are not just like me. So both of those things are happening at the same time. Both of those kind of cultural trends are happening at the same time, where we need to encourage people to tell stories from their own perspective, but also encourage all creators to expand their kind of roster of characters and their different kinds of themes that they're able to produce. I think I rambled a little bit too much.
That's no problem.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. No problem. Justin, the first time that I was familiar with your name was from Shirtlifter number 3, which also had work from our former co-host and my good friend Matt Broussard when he was using his fuzz belly.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that.
And from that, it led me to some of your other work, specifically Hard to Swallow. Why don't you just tell the listening audience, for lack of a better word, podcast audience, I don't know how you would define it, a little bit about your own work and, specifically some of the erotic work that you've done.
Mm-hmm. So I started off doing this with this sacred text, which was this kind of retelling of the Dead Sea Scrolls story. I went from there to doing a series called True Travel Tales, where I was spending a lot of my life wandering around, mostly the third world with a backpack, living extremely cheaply. Every time I get an extra little chunk of money, I would work and get a little extra chunk of money, then go back on the road and travel around. And I'd make comics from it. So, I would kind of stop at some place like in Laos and for like $1 a night, hut somewhere and make comics for a week and then continue on. And so those were my travel comics. And then I really wanted to work with my friend Dave Davenport, who's a phenomenally talented tattoo artist down in Los Angeles. And he finally agreed to work with me, contacted me. He said, okay, I want to do a book with you, but I want to do erotic work. I want to do, erotic comics. And, I had to kind of wrap my head around that. And I was like, all right, let's do this, And I'm really, really glad that I did that, because we did Hard to Swallow for, I think, 4 years. And it really opened me up as a creator, so to speak. It was very important for me to learn how to kind of loosen up and do bigger illustrations, more kind of in-your-face style storytelling. What I was used to was more the kind of indie comics aesthetic, which tended to have be much more removed from its subject matter. You're oftentimes with the camera angle is really far back from the subject. It's very kind of staid and still. And you can't do that with erotica. You've got to get in there. Right? You got to have the money shot. You got to have the splash page. You got to get, see the close-ups, all that stuff. So it really pushed me as a creator to get more dramatic and get more engaged. And I'm really, really glad about that. And it was a lot of fun. I love doing erotica. And I really think that it's funny, every semester when I teach with my students, I bring in a big stack of erotic comics, and I kind of slam them on the table. And I say, I look out across them and I say, okay, you're all here in art school, and everyone here at some point should make pornography, make erotica, because it's an incredibly important, social and political thing to do. Especially if you're a woman, a queer person, a person of color, but whoever you are, don't let someone else colonize your sexual space. Make your own erotic work. Put it out there in the world, and people will love you for it. And it's an incredibly important thing to do.
So how did you make the journey from backpacker to academic?
Yeah, interesting. My parents were academics, actually. And I spent most of my life running away from their family business. But I was working in San Francisco, making comics, and also massage therapist. That was how I was paying my bills. And then I was contacted by my friend Matt Sillity. He was starting to teach undergraduate comics classes at CCA, and brought me in to help teach some of those. And then we started, imagining this MFA in comics program. So created that. And I haven't looked back since. I've been teaching graduate and undergraduate comics classes now, and mentoring graduate students as well in their thesis production for the last 7 years. And I love it. I love it. Teaching has really been very exciting for me. It's really wonderful to be able to pay back, to kind of help fire up students, their own passion for this form and for their storytelling, to help them realize their own dreams. I feel really strongly about it. I mean, it's, we thought a lot of it when we created this program, about what it would mean. I went to art school and I came out and didn't make art professionally for many years. And I'm still kind of bitter about that. and part of it was because the school didn't prepare me for that, right? So the school taught me how to do a lino cut print or pull a silkscreen print, create something in 3-point perspective, but not how to create a portfolio, approach a gallery, pay my taxes as an artist, how to teach, anything like that. And that's how you actually make your living as an artist. So we have a very robust professional practice program, classes within our program. And I feel really, really strongly about that. I think it's unethical actually to have a program that asks for time and money from students and then doesn't provide them ways to make a living with this afterward. So I hope this can kind of snowball, right? We'll have more and more people teaching comics and creating different kinds of careers out of them.
So it seems like you're a very busy man. Do you have any other comic projects of your own?
Yeah, I'm working on a big graphic novel right now called Castle and Creek. So it's set in the National Guard Armory here in San Francisco, which takes up about half a block at 14th and Mission. And it's this amazing building built in 1915. It looks like a castle. It's just this massive, massive structure. And it was vacant for many years when I first got here. And then it was sold to kink.com, which is a streaming internet porn company. And about 10 years ago, I was a porn actor. I did porn, and I did a shoot there in the building and became obsessed with the building. There's a creek, Mission Creek, that runs from the top of Bernal Heights all the way down to Mission Bay. It's been paved over all the way through the city, but it still runs free in the basement of the National Guard Armory building, which is bizarre, right? So I came up with this whole idea of someone who in the 1930s, a National Guardsman who dies in the river. He's a closeted gay man. He dies in the creek, and he is haunting the armory. And then the main characters are this young man who comes up to do porn for the first time. He meets a grizzled old porn veteran. They have a kind of daddy-boy relationship. The guy's hooked on meth as well. And this ghost is kind of haunting their relationship as well as the armory and kind of inhabiting them at different times. And there's also a meta-narrative with a parody of the Golden Age Wonder Woman that's happening, which was really fun to create. And they're trying to find the lesbian underground cartoonist who created this parody. They're trying to track her down to get the last issue, and we see those comics happening through the book. So it's a huge. It's going to be over 300 pages. It's it's going to be very weird and very queer. So it's either going to be amazing or it's going to face plant oh my God. It'll be a spectacular face plant at the very least.
And then looking at some of your biographical material, I have to ask, as someone who's been an Alice Cooper fan since he was 9 years old, you have a pet python?
Yes. No, yeah, it's a ball python, Ashe. It actually came with my husband. So yeah, he's been around for a while now. He's over 20 now.
All right, Justin, if people want to reach out to you over the interwebs, where would they go?
I'm on Twitter at JustinComics. Let's see here. I've got, a page on the CCA site at cca.edu if you just look up Justin Hall. And Facebook. And we're really promoting this Kickstarter page. So if you look on Kickstarter, look for No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics. Please check it out and spread the word. and we're going to try to get this film done and out to the film festival circuit and the comic circuit next year.
Great. And again, naturally, I'll link to those resources. In terms of how long people have with this Kickstarter window, when do you have the campaign going till?
May 22nd.
Justin, thank you so much for coming on. And let me just tell you, boys, if you see what Justin looks like online, woof.
Are you objectifying me, Bill?
A little bit.
I'll do anything to stop comment.
Justin, thanks so much, and I hope this is the first of many times you come on.
I appreciate this so much. I love chatting with you. You're amazing. It's an incredible guy. So and I love what you're doing here. So I would love to come back.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks again. Well, we're going to wrap this episode up. Again, Justin, thank you so much for coming on to the show. And please, everyone, check out that Kickstarter for No Straight Lines, the documentary film. When we wrap up an episode of the Comic Book Bears, we do so with a segment we call the Woofs of the Week segment, where we spotlight something, be it a film or a comic book or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, may be interested in sampling. And my woof, oh boy, this is weird doing this by yourself. My woof this week goes out to the film The Death of Stalin, which was co-written and directed by Armando Iannucci. It stars Steve Buscemi, Simon Russell Beale, Jeffrey Tambor, Michael Palin, and a bunch of other great actors. It literally covers what the title is, The Death of Stalin. It's actually based on a French graphic novel, La Mort de Staline. And if you've been familiar with Iannucci's past works, like The Thick of It and In the Loop, and over here in the States, Veep, it's very much within that wheelhouse. The one-liners fly at rapid speed. And he somehow makes real-life horrors the subject of hilarity. It is an incredibly funny film about some not very funny people. It's in theaters right now, The Death of Stalin. So thanks again for listening to the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. If you want to subscribe to us, you can do so through iTunes. You can listen to us through Stitcher Radio. And if you ever want to reach out to us, you can do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Billy Z. You're going to hear a woof and an explosion, and we'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone. Woof!
Breathing from a hole in my lung, I had no one but faces in front of me, racing through the void in my head to find traces of a good luck academy. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Sparks ignite and trading for thought about no one and nothing in particular. Watch the sick and socket